Peter's work lies at the heart of the discipline, at the intersection between international relations and comparative politics, where I think, in a sense, we should be positioning our work. Its focus is on political economy, security, and cultural and civilizational processes in regional and world politics, initially as a Europeanist, more recently with a growing focus on Asia. Peter is the Walter S. Carpenter Jr. Professor of International Studies at Cornell University, where since 2004 he has been a Stephen H. Weiss Presidential Fellow. He's a former president of the American Political Science Association and was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1987 and to the American Philosophical Society in 2009. He's won a host of prestigious awards and prizes, far too long to list in a short introduction. His recent books include, since 2005 alone, I have to stop it at this point, because otherwise we'd have run out of time in this session, but they include Anglo-America and its Discontents, Sinicization and the Rise of China, Civilizations in World Politics, Beyond Paradigms, Analytic Eclecticism in World Politics, European Identity, Rethinking Japanese Security, Anti-Americanisms in World Politics, Religion in Expanding Europe, Beyond Japan, East Asian Regionalism, and A World of Regions, Asia and Europe and the American Imperium, all since 2005. This is in fact the tip of the proverbial iceberg, for he is also in fact the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of some 40 books, and author or co-author of a further 100 articles and book chapters, invariably in the world's leading journals. In a symposium on his work published in the APSA's journal PS in 2008, a most impressive array of commentators identified in his scholarship 4 key and enduringly consistent themes. And in a sense, I draw attention to these because I think they provide a very strong rationale for the reason why we invited Peter, which is that he's so fantastically well placed to contextualise Europe's predicament today. Those themes were firstly the distinctiveness of national societies and traditions, culturally, structurally and politically, that's the first. Secondly, the importance of structural and cultural legacies and hence the need to contextualise the present and processes of change historically. Thirdly, the linkages between cultural and structural processes and practices and the degree to which domestic and indeed international structures are rooted in cultural practices. And fourthly, a resistance to, as his commentators put it, and I quote, the abstraction of central tendencies found in statistical models or the core strategic interactions highlighted in formal models. To these, if I might be so bold, I'm tempted to add a fifth, the theme of crisis. What I mean by that is that right from his earliest work, Peter has provided us with the analytic resources we need to make sense of moments of crisis. As this hopefully suggests, whether there are 4 or 5 key themes in his work, there is no one better placed to contextualise Europe's predicament and to assess its prospects. His title is The European Predicament, Global and Local Dimensions. Peter Katzenstein, welcome to the Sheffield.
Then start here with a funny remark, a grim joke, and a specification of my topic. The funny remark. Sarah Boswell, where are you, Sarah? She outside? There you are. Our logistical angel writes me on June 6th, rattling my cage. This lecture is less than a month away. We ask you to speak 1 hour and to allow 30 minutes for discussion. You rattled my cage, Sarah. I answer her, I am not Fidel Castro. I will talk as long as I can before sinking to the floor with exhaustion. Audiences I talk to normally are fast asleep after 45 minutes. Her answer was a smiley face. Okay, 40 minutes. So, Sarah's assignment is, and that's pretty clear, I shall keep you awake for a little while. The grim joke. An Icelander asked a Swiss, why does a landlocked country need a ministry of fisheries? The Swiss looks at the Icelander and asks instead, why do you have a minister of finance? The balance sheets of the 3 Icelandic banks went in a few years from 100 to 1,000% of GDP, roughly comparable to Switzerland. What would have happened if Switzerland had defaulted? That would have blown the European crisis into a global one. But the bailout of USB was very smart. The Swiss knew how to fit toxic assets to the circumstances of the bank. to the tune of adding roughly $6 billion of fresh capital and taking $60 billion of toxic assets off the books. The Swiss National Bank was very proactive and infused liquidity into the interbank 3-month credit market. In contrast, Icelandic bankers on average had been on the job for less than 6 years when the crisis hit. There was no depth of capital, no expertise, and no institutional repertoires compared to Switzerland. So the outcome was not surprising once the international financial crisis really got started. So in order to understand the crisis, I think you have to understand the local conditions. And I was just talking to somebody, I forgot their name unfortunately, but who could explain to me the outlier of a Canadian bank which really behaved like an American bank. Okay? And that specificity, which is really important. So what happened in Iceland? After a very successful stabilization package put in place by the first left-wing government in the last 60 years, working closely with the IMF, the Icelandic public just voted the conservative and progressive parties back into power, ready apparently for a second swig from the bottle of tax rebates and deregulation. A sobering example of the triumph of ideology over interest and of what can happen after a massive crash of the kind which Europe has not experienced. The Icelandic crash is much larger, and what certainly has not yet happened in the United States. Therefore, the predicament, is not one in which self-correction is going to happen automatically. In fact, democratic policy is likely to lead to repetition of mistakes. The specification of the topic, like all titles, this one is chosen way ahead of the time, and has of course nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about. So I will talk about the sovereign debt crisis, and there will be 4 parts to the talk. One is on crisis, the second one is on sovereignty, the third one is on debt, and then what can we learn, what have we learned. And the fourth part is longer. It will really draw out things about academic theories of international relations and political economy. And a very brief conclusion if Sarah is still awake. So let me talk about sovereign debt crisis, focusing on the concept of crisis. Crisis terminology is overused. When I started in this business, there was the crisis of capitalism. This was in the 1970s, and a good friend of mine, Klaus Offer, said, when the unemployment rate hits 4%, the system is not self-sustaining. And I said, Klaus, how can you be so sure? He said, I just know it in my bones. So we take great liberty with conventional understandings of the concept of crisis. Crisis is defined by pressure, time pressure to make decisions. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a crisis. September 2008 was a crisis. They had to make it up as they went along. And it's amazing to read about it. Okay? There was no playbook. So that is a crisis not of capitalism, but a crisis in capitalism. Decision makers have to act. Sometimes we have crises in our personal lives. We can't sit them out. You have to act, often under intense time pressure. And when it happens to me, I start to sweat, I can't focus. I mean, all the things which people write about, crisis decision making, happened to me then. Okay? So that's a crisis in capitalism. Now the crises of capitalism, and here it's the plural, they're systemic. They always come and go. The crisis in the singular, I think, is hyped by academics to sell their books. Because it says our time is special. Okay? But I don't believe that that's true. Crisis is normal. That's going to be the bottom line of this talk. So what are the historical stages of this set of crises? There is, I just read Wolfgang Streeck's book, it's a wonderful book. It's built against the golden era of capitalism, European capitalism. There was in the golden era high growth, national capitalism, functioning democracy in the 1960s. Well, I'm old enough to remember some of the 1960s, as is Wolfgang, by the way. Yeah? There was a taxation system and a welfare state, and they were calibrated. There was, of course, much variation between different kinds of welfare states and different kinds of democracies. There was, in the transatlantic economy, Japan lurking in the wings, but nobody saw it coming. And of course, Japan then as the forerunner of the revolutionary changes that Asia has brought to capitalism. The air was clean. Cows gave a lot of uncontaminated milk, and democratic capitalism was functioning. That's the trope. We all build our tropes. Only one slight blemish. The depiction of a paradise which never existed. It didn't seem so at the time. Small crises existed. Gas pipeline politics. Eisenhower's 1958 rolling readjustment. That was a crisis of capitalism. Kennedy in 1961, the balance of payment crisis. That was the great systemic crisis for Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson and the inflationary double war he fought. The creaking fixed exchange rate system from 1961 onward. So if we disregard all of this, then we have to say these actors were all suffering from false consciousness. And I don't want to do that. They lived with crises. So maybe there was no golden age. Now what about the golden age compared to its past? And that, of course, is a much more sobering notion. The 1960s were sort of more normal, but against the background of catastrophic wars and depression. So catastrophic wars and depression without parallel in the 20th century. So maybe there is no golden era after all. Actually, those depressions, go back well into the 19th century. Arms races, the whole thing. So that normality was bought at a very high price. So maybe we create our image of normality to have a compass, to guide us, to make our politics more appealing to our audiences. So I'm not sure that there is a golden era. I think we pretended, and I think we need it psychologically in order to maintain our credentials as critical intellectuals. But what is the crisis? What are the sets of crises of the last 30 or 40 years? Well, there are, I think, three. One I remember very clearly, the crisis of capitalism in the 1970s. That was after the breakdown of the flexible exchange rate. It was stagflation. Economists were baffled. They couldn't understand it. It was the oil crisis, the end of flexible exchange rates, a lost war in Vietnam, seeming to end American hegemony, the collapse of Keynesianism, and a fiscal illegitimation crisis of the state. This produced scholarship from the left, O'Connor and Offit, but also from the right, Charles Lindblom. Okay? Now this decade was a decade which prepared us for an economic paradigm change and a new policy and political era, neoliberalism, Reaganism, and Thatcherism. That era came to an end in 2008. I would call this the crisis of capitalism. Point two, financial globalization. Indebted state and credit economies. Now, it was a wonderful run for a long time. And Ian just gave me his very brief book, in which he makes a compelling case, like Herman Schwartz, whose book I've read, how the two are linked, the asset bubble and the financial crisis. Now, it starts in the 1980s, I still remember, because I bought my first house, with an unbelievable set of interest rate variations in 1980. I think the peak interest rate at the beginning and at the end of the year was 19% in the United States. Okay? And I locked in a mortgage at 12%. Was I lucky in June? Okay. 12% interest rate, lucky. Okay. So this was Volcker wringing out the inflation rate out of the economy. And on the whole, President Reagan going along with it. He sort of said, okay, I got another 3 years before the next election, maybe this is going to solve the problem. And then, of course, tax cuts and debt explosion. That is the transformation of American conservatism to something totally new and different. Okay? And in many ways, it's the fiscal recklessness of conservatives which begins the end run into 2007, 2008. This, of course, then repeated 20, 30 years later under the second Bush. What comes in the 1980s is the Mexican debt crisis in Latin America, which people now have forgotten, but Latin America for a decade had negative growth rates, with one country the exception. Which country? Colombia. if you serve the American drug market, you make money. No other country has positive growth rates. You know, the whole thing, I mean, the Americans not wanting to write off their debts, you know, takes the American administration 7 or 8 years to realize they can't collect 50% of the interest on the debt. If you look at the European debates now, this is the kind of politics which is appearing now. So this was an unmitigated disaster for Latin America. So Europe in the 1980s is slogging through structural readjustment, slowly, and convergence of currency values and interest rates in preparation for further monetary integration. But there's a lot of variation. Some happy stories, some unhappy stories, and we don't have time to do it. But in the mid-1980s, the era of the big bangs, of financial deregulation. Now, one nice irony of this era of financial deregulation is that while these big banks happen in London and in New York and also in Tokyo, it is the French and the Germans who create the era of global financial deregulation. This is a story Rabi Abdullah tells in this very important book. And it's rule-bound deregulation. The French and the Germans want rules. And it's the German Bundesbank with its insistence on the clause of erga omnes, which is attached to every European treaty after 1988, I think, okay, says we want full capital liberalization. So it's the French and the German project to institutionalize financial globalization. It's not the American project. Larry Summers was perfectly happy doing bilateral deals, right? Because big powers win in bilateral deals. It was the French and the Germans who said, no, 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 no. We want this as a general rule. This has been largely forgotten in Europe, and it is a nice ironic twist to our current predicament. Then since 2007, 2008, the crisis point 3, with two related features now. Central banks, in my opinion, now maintain the capitalist system by infusing huge amounts of liquidity. Just think of what Bernanke did. I think he had no choice, by the way. Think of what Draghi has done in the last year. And think of Abenomics. The Japanese are going to be even more dramatic. So this is a way of extending the lifeline of indebted financial systems and the credit state. Now, central banks, you know, are not democratic institutions. That's the one thing you can conclude from the last 30 years. But they are keeping the ship afloat. And then, of course, there are political fights in democratic polities about this, about what kind of consolidation policy should occur. How should public debt be managed? We have our Tea Party in the United States. The European Tea Party speaks German. And of course, within Germany, there is a Tea Party now. Germany has used its policy of what they call the brake on debt, Schuldenbremse, as of 2010. It has made it European-wide by 2012, the 2012 Fiscal Compact. You got a Chinese Tea Party. They're very wary about liberalization, capital liberalization. And of course, you have a Japanese Tea Party, the deflationary policy regime that's now being challenged. So in every country, there are major political debates about how to deal with this set of issues. Let me then shift to the second part, the sovereign debt crisis, focusing on sovereignty. Now we'll use Iceland as a microcosm. For in some ways, Iceland's collapse was a prelude to the global crisis, just as Bulgaria's in December 1996 was a prelude to the Asian financial crisis. But the global financial system is so intricate that nobody in 1996 really understood what Bulgaria meant until it reappeared 8 months later in Thailand, and then later in Korea and Indonesia. So Iceland had the same sort of standing, I think, although people were more aware of, you know, that if something isn't right in Iceland, something isn't right. Okay? I mean, the sense on Wall Street was by August 2007, something wasn't right. The banks ran their mouth and they realized something was really not right. And this sort of at the same time. So what happened in Iceland? Well, it was the adoption of a neoliberal policy paradigm, had never been existed in Iceland before 2000, an asset bubble, and shady financial practices. That is things which are common in the United States, in Ireland, Spain, Greece, and Portugal. What was distinctive of Iceland was the compressed time frame and the recklessness. The tripling of GDP between 2001 and 2007. As in the US, everyone was taken in on this. I went to Iceland, it's a case I'm now interested in, not for the run-up to the crisis, but how you deal with the crisis after this happened. You know, you couldn't buy a car by paying cash. I talked to somebody that she became a professor there, and she said, well, she wanted to pay with her car in cash. The guy sent her away. I said, I don't know how to do that. Come back in the afternoon. I talked to the supervisor. The way you bought a car was to get credit. They gave you $20,000 on top of the car. It was unbelievable. Like buying a house in Nevada. So elites overlooked it. Common people liked it. Reykjavik was, you know, even the shops now in Reykjavik still look a whole lot different than when I was there last time in 2003. And the banks took on enormous risks and toxic assets. So what then happened was the reduction of GDP by half, which is very sharp. In the United States, reduction of GDP by about 3.5%, order of magnitude less. So Americans haven't really tasted the depression the way the Icelanders have. But in many cases, it was the loss of paper gains. And this I can empathize with. I loved looking at my retirement earnings in the run-up to 2008. Boy, I felt like I was playing Monopoly. I felt rich. I live in a small town, you can't spend the money, so that was good. You know, but it went up and up and up. You know, I said, this is good. You know, and I don't work for money, but you feel good about it. You know, and then suddenly those paper assets get wiped out. Instead of, 100, I only have 60. Well, doesn't feel so good. So this happens in Iceland, right? And so what the per capita income was 200, now it's 100, but their personal debt level is much higher because of the nature of the mortgage market. So debt now is 40% of their assets on average. And they will need 20 years to work it off. Now, unlike the Greeks, the Icelandics have, like the Brits, a stiff upper lip. They don't complain, they just do it. But it hurts, and it changes life plans for a generation. The fact that the suffering is privatized and not politically discussed doesn't mean that there is no suffering. The interesting notion about Iceland, by the way, is that Iceland is saved by the IMF, and the IMF acts like a Scandinavian welfare state. This was extraordinary, because the head of the delegation was a Dane who lands in Reykjavik and says, we will not let you go under. We believe in the Scandinavian model, not realizing that the Icelanders were not part of the Scandinavian model. They were part of American neoliberalism. So you had a total role reversal. Whether this will be a lasting effect on the IMF's part remains to be seen. He is now head of the committee in the IMF overseeing Greece. We were intellectually totally unprepared. The risk models, for example, on the in the real estate bubble, which American banks run, were off by 10 to 30,000% in their categorization of mortgages. Okay? 30,000% on the tail of the distribution, 10,000% in the center. So that raises a very interesting question: how can risk models, and these are very sophisticated ones, be so wrong? I'll come back to that later. As of September 2012, that is less than a year ago, 70% of the institutional investors in the United States equity market expect a tail risk event to occur within a year. They've got 3 months to go. That is, they expect another collapse of the financial system. These are the institutional investors. So there is an enormous amount of uncertainty by institutional investors about the solidity of the financial system. None of this exists, what I would call, in everyday experience in the United States. And from what I can read in the European press, it doesn't exist in Europe either. It certainly doesn't exist in China, where it just was. And I don't think it exists in Japan, where Abenomics is giving everybody sort of the feeling, finally we move. But the institutional investors feel that they're on very thin ice. Why? Because they have come to appreciate uncertainty. These risk models were risk models. They had no role for uncertainty because you cannot model uncertainty. And the crisis is so recent that the people who actually have to make investment decisions are keenly aware of the importance of uncertainty. Now the public debate, which we all follow, is played out as morality play. First there's undeserving Iceland, then there's profligate Greece, or Irish, or Spaniards, or Portuguese, or Italians, or French, and they're the frugal Germans, and the Dutch, and the Danes, and the Finns, right? It's North versus South. Same debate, by the way, in the United States. Stockman's recent book has the same sort of morality play tenor to it. But political economy is not a morality play. There's nothing unusual here. Latin America in the 1980s, Mexico in 1982 and 94, Asia after 1997. Asia after 1997 wipes out $3 trillion worth of assets. The Mexican debt crises wipe out the Mexican middle class for a decade. Not noticed in the United States and Europe, but noticed in Mexico. Russia, we all know what happened in Russia. Argentina in 2001. So it's these distributional struggles and crises occur throughout the last 30 years, and there are struggles between creditors and debtors, government and the private sector. This now plays out within European countries and of course between European countries. It's what I would call normal crisis politics. Nothing unusual. We've just repressed all these other episodes. So what's the short-term solution? And since we are dead in the long term, as we all know, short-term is the only place in crisis politics, central banks. As a reserve currency, the United States had the freedom to pump $3 trillion worth of money into markets. It was an emergency transfusion. Congress asked questions. The central banks refused to say anything. There was no democratic accountability. There was no democratic discussion. And the ship sort of was kept afloat. And then in the fall of 2012, the same thing happens in Europe, and Draghi rescues the euro with a similar move. I've forgotten the exact figures, but it's somewhere around $1 trillion now. But it's growing. Now the Germans, of course, resist because of their fear of inflation, but also for legal reasons that basically, they say this is not constitutional, and the law is a flexible instrument, even in the German Supreme Court. So, and now Japan is, to watch the press conferences of the Japanese central bank is amazing. It's the central banker wagging its finger saying, we will create inflation. This is extraordinary if you watch central bank press conferences over the last 30 years. This is not the job of a central bank. But in an economy stuck in a deflationary mode for over 20 years, this is the last gamble. And if Europe goes the way of Japan, which is well possible, this may become the European future. So how is inflation forever solved? I doubt it. In America, on the left, Krugman, for example, insists there will be no inflation. But I don't think he actually insists there will be no inflation. There's no inflation in the medium term for in the next 3 to 5 years. That may well be right. But this amount of infusion of liquidity will create inflation. This seems to me a foregone conclusion. We don't know when and what the conditions will be. If you bought gold, you're unlucky because you missed it. Okay? It's not going to be inflation over the next 3 years. Now we now have good data from Rogoff and Reinhardt, that the crisis of this kind occurs every 18 months, and the big crisis occurs every 10 years. This is over the last 500 years. So by that account, around 2018-19, just in time for Basel III, we will have another big crisis. I don't know whether this projection is right, but maybe they're off by 3 or 5 years, one way or the other. Maybe these institutional investors are right, it's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 months. Maybe if Reiner and Rogov are wrong, maybe it'll be not 2019, it'll be 2024. But there will be a big crisis. What will be a big crisis after 2007? It's not clear to me what it would be other than a run on the dollar. That would be a big crisis. Because it would mean there would be no reserve unit. And that would require rethinking in a crisis condition and an intense time pressure for everybody of something really quite unique in the history of capitalism. So the coordination, which I found most impressive in 2008, against the background of the 1930s and by somebody who had studied the 1930s. Bernanke was one of the most preeminent scholars on the 1930s. So he knew exactly what he wanted to avoid. The coordination, I think, next time around, if the crisis were to come in the next 3 or 5 years, will not be as effective. The political capital is not there. The nerves are, our nerves are frayed, and the political capital are there, not there in the United States. So sovereignty will be deeply implicated in the reconstructions of national capacities to act, and maybe in the international coordination of how to get on top of something which will be bigger than it was in 2000. That's not the end of the world, but it is, a challenge. Let me move to the debt part. Now the debt regime, the current debt regime, is an innovation of American conservatism, not of British conservatism. Maggie Thatcher wanted to use the oil money from the North Sea oil to pay down the national debt. This was not a mind frame that Ronald Reagan shaped. So the debt regime which Reagan initiates, American debt increases by 190% during the Reagan presidency, largely because of the tax cuts. It increases by 155% by the elder Bush. It increases by 37% under Clinton. It increases by 115% under the younger Bush, and it increases by 16% under Obama. So what's really behind the debt, the debt crisis of fiscal state, is the tax-cutting regime of American conservatives. And it leads, of course, to both debt and a sharp growth in inequality. So public debt in the United States right now runs around $14 trillion, about 90% of the GDP, right in the middle of the OECD data. It's not that the Americans are particularly debt. They're sort of like a normal country. And it's the European level, basically. Greece is an outlier, Belgium is an outlier. But public debt is a small part. Private debt is what drives the system. It's consumption-led growth. Private debt runs about $36 trillion in the United States. That's about 260%. And I just checked with Ian before, and he says, yeah, that's sort of a European figure too. Europeans are between 190 and 330%. So it's a systemic change in the nature of capitalism that's brought about by the innovation of, diners card, credit cards with individual shops in the 1930s and 1940s. Then comes the revolution. Somebody says, can't we do this for restaurants? Well, but there's 60,000 restaurants in Manhattan alone. How can you do that? How we create a credit card which is good for all dining places? And then comes Visa 10 years later, and the credit economy. When my daughters graduated from high school in the 1990s, I counted how many credit cards they got for free. Okay, each one of them had roughly $500 or $800 worth of credit. I confiscated all of them, and I stopped counting after 50. That's a lot of debt a teenager can take on, and then pay back at 18% per month, right? With no income, of course. Right? So you get into the habit of declaring personal bankruptcy. So the structure of capitalism, driven by consumption, changes attitudes in a fundamental way. Because there's always a piece of plastic which will help you pay the bills until you get swallowed up like a bad bank by your interest rates. And the banks are interested in pushing credit cards because the returns on capital in that market are extremely high. This all from a book of Colin at Cornell. So private debt is essential to the growth model. Now think about China. China is reorganizing its economy away from export-led growth to urbanization of 250 to 500 million people in the next 20 years to spur domestic growth. Its credit card market looks like that, the growth curve. Okay. Savings rates are enormously high in China. So this model has an enormous amount of play in China and of course in India. It's not at its end. It may be tapering off in Europe and the United States, but there's a lot of potential for this market in Asia. So it's by no means that we are at the end here. We may be turning a page. So how does this debt regime look after the crisis? Lehman Brothers went under with $60 billion worth of debt. And I've always been trying to figure out how large is the debt in Europe? It's larger, this one I know, although the economy, the European economy is roughly the size of the American one. But how much larger? I found one figure in the last 3 years. In the Financial Times, no attribution, it said $400 billion or euros, I can't remember, it doesn't make a difference, for France and $200 billion for Germany. $600 billion. The European financial crisis is not a crisis of Greece or Spain or Italy, it's a crisis of German and French banking system. And then, on the plane to this lecture, I find another article in the Financial Times by Wolfgang Müncher, June 24th. And he starts off, he makes back of the envelope calculation. I want to give you some figures because the concluding figure makes sense to me. The European Stability Mechanism has just decreed that it can use 60 billion euros of its 500 billion euros for recapitalization of European banks. If there's more capital needed, it'll have to come from national governments or from investors, and most likely it will come mostly from investors who will take a haircut of 70, 80, or 90%. Right? So there's the 60 billion, and let's just forget whether it's euros or dollars, it's not important. The units are much larger. There's 60 billion, Lehman Brothers is 60 billion, okay? This Financial Times estimate from 2 years ago was 600 billion. Well, that's an order of magnitude larger. Last week, a French newspaper, Les Echos, came up with a figure of 1 trillion. I don't know how they came up with it, but it's more than 600 billion, and this makes sense because the crisis has been extended. More countries have gone up, like Cyprus, but so that toxic acid should have been increased. Now, what we do know is that the total balance sheet of European banks is $26 trillion. And we do know that roughly 5% of those $26 trillion appear on the balance sheets of banks which are underwater, which are bad banks. That's 5%. Okay. Now you have to make an estimate of how big are the bad assets of the good banks. Toxic assets which are being carried by the good banks, and they hope to write them down somehow. And basically what you do, you don't announce that you have toxic assets, you re-extend the credit line knowing that you will never collect. Because you don't want to undermine the confidence of the market in your bank. So he looks then at various figures and saying, well, what was toxic assets for Ireland? 10% or more. Greece, 24%. Slovenia, 18%. Spain, Portugal, 10% or more. Okay. Then he looks at Germany. He doesn't have good data on Germany, but I do know that the public banks in Germany are bankrupt, the Landesbank. And the reason for Germany's opposition to Basel III, Britain wanted it, France wanted it, US wanted it, they all wanted it by 2014. The Germans said, no. 2019. was the desperate hope of staving off a big political controversy about the bankruptcy of the Landesbank. Okay. So they're bankrupt. But of course, the second largest bank was bankrupt. It was nationalized, merged with the third largest bank. So you don't know. But you do know that the Germans run a current account surplus of 6% of GDP. Well, they must have taken in some toxic assets. So even the solid German core has an unknown number of toxic assets. So what Münchauer comes up with is saying, well, let's just double the figure. 5% bad banks, 5% toxic assets in good banks. 10%, 2.6 trillion. Then he says, I may be way off. Let's take out the size of the Italian GDP, 1.5 trillion. We'll come to a figure of 1 trillion, 1.2 trillion. And then he says, do we really want to know whether they can recapitalize with $60 billion, which is 1/20th of that figure? So it's a sobering set of calculations which I'm going through here because Europe is stuck in a financial crisis infinitely worse than the United States and infinitely worse than Japan or China. And there's no indication that European banks or European governments know how to get out of it. And that will create a politics of desperation, as it is in Greece now, if this thing spreads. Now, there are some pieces of indirect evidence which suggest that the politicians are aware of this and the central bankers. There have been no tough stress tests. There was a charade of a stress test of European banks 2 years ago. Draghi's dramatic policy in the fall 2012, I think, can only be understood against this background. Basically, a policy of giving interest-free loans to commercial banks to help their profits so that they can begin in the medium term to write off some of the toxic assets. I think it's a sensible policy. Okay? And of course, a big fight with the German Bundesbank. Now, unlike the French, Draghi is not arguing for a simple monetarizing of the debt. That's what the French want. They want a vernacular solution to their problems. And unlike the Germans, he's doing something. The Germans don't want to do anything. So he is threading the needle and says, yes, we need structural reforms, just like the Germans. And we need undercover monetarization. Right? It's politically the right solution. Whether it'll work or not is another question. So you have now an intensification of domestic conflicts, vulnerabilities of groups, sectors, and coalitions within and between countries. Looking at these data, I think the debt economy creates for Europe a debt crisis which will go on for many years. I don't think this is a short-term or medium-term thing. Unless somebody comes up with a way of writing off for the financial sector $1 trillion or $2 trillion worth of toxic assets. And that's hard for me to see how this may happen. And the notion of growth versus austerity, I'd say, well, if there is a third way, this would be nice to know. But it will have to do something about getting rid of these toxic assets. So let me conclude with a somewhat more theoretical part. What can we learn? What have we learned? Why does political economy in America, why is it so silent on the financial crisis? If you look at the major journals, no articles. I went I invited myself actually to a conference of modern political economists held every year. It's about 80 very brilliant people, young. They're all marvelous, right? It's organized by Princeton and Wisconsin, and so, interesting people. And I counted the number of papers on the financial crisis between 2008 and 2012, given that. And there are probably 100 papers per year, okay? 4, okay? So why the silence? And I think it has a lot to do with the distinction between risk and uncertainty, made by Knight and Keynes in 1921. So Keynes, in 1937, then writes an important article in the Journal of Economics and says, financial assets do not have objective properties. probabilities. This is different from the real economy, because you have to think ahead. You can't price it. So what we have instead in financial markets are rules of thumb, habits, stories, conventions, all sorts of things to stabilize expectations and to give us the courage to get up in the morning and to put a lot of money on the table making bets. You can't do this with existential uncertainty in your head. You have to do it with some set of confidence. And there are a whole set of social conventions which make this possible. One of these conventions, by the way, are risk-based models. There are numbers there. They say I'm protected 97% of the time. I feel better. Let's put value on the table. Okay. So what happened after 1937, starting in the late 1940s, is that economics as a discipline began to convert uncertainty into risk, and increasingly insisted that this distinction was trivial. Expected utility theory, by Norman and Morgenstern in 1947, Savage in 1954, are the beginning of this. And there's a wonderful book written on the sociology of knowledge and economics about how, through twists and turns, without a great plan, brilliant work over several decades ends up in rational expectation theory. But each one of them chips away at the notion that uncertainty is a category worth keeping. So rational expectation theory by Robert Lucas then comes to the conclusion that present crises incorporate the knowledge about all future developments. That's a big claim. Okay? It has the advantage of making it possible to price options in financial markets. It's of enormous practical significance, and Wall Street makes a ton of money on this over the last 30 years. Okay? But the argument it embodies requires that uncertainty is no longer part of social science. So what you have in finance economics by the so-called quants is basically models, highly sophisticated, which eliminate uncertainty altogether in the 1990s, and which are cleverly packaged into new products, and which have data series going back maybe a decade. No data series being back further than 1990. So you cannot really see the fat tails, the unexpected events over 10 years. There are no black swans. All swans are white. So we know, however, from behavioral economics that the foundational assumptions of these models, based on lots of experimental evidence, are wrong. People don't think that way. They behave differently. So then comes, as the predictable eventual disaster, the models didn't work. Now, one guy in finance, who wrote 4 or 5 books on this and said, this is crazy. And he was wrong 4 or 5 times. That was Soros. Soros has a war with modern economics, and he has a self-reflexive theory, which he developed as a trader. And he was one of the most successful traders in modern capitalism. Which, by the way, leads to him, when he describes it, to bodily functions that change. His ulcer acts up during the crisis. He's full of nervous energy. But his model is saying, basically, everybody looks at what the other guy is doing in the financial crisis. I will do something different. That's his model, okay? Self-reflexive. So what now happens is that international political economy, taking its playbook from economics, has only risk-based models. Actually, I found a paper by a former student of mine, David Lake, and then Jeff Fried from 1989, where it's a meaningless distinction. Right? Now, I've been back and forth with David for the last 4 years. I've run 3 papers on this with Steve Nelson. You want to see the papers, right? But the silence is based on the fact that for modern political economy, it's a world of risk. And the financial crisis has reintroduced the notion of uncertainty. The best place to now go and do this work, I think, is in Munich, by the way. Okay. The reinsurance company in Munich, the largest reinsurance company in the world. They are, they have to convert in order to make money, all uncertainty into risk, but they're much more sophisticated, and they're much more behavioral. Okay. Blue Poly is not doing that. So it's not a world of uncertainty. I'm pretty sure that ceiling isn't going to collapse on us for any talk. Okay? It's a work of risk and uncertainty. It's the mixture. And you have to have judgment and saying, when is there more uncertainty, when is there more risk? So I don't want to denigrate the importance of economics or political economy. I'm just saying the reintroduction of the category of uncertainty and economic sociology makes this game, for me, intellectually more interesting, and for them, intractable, because they can no longer just rely on risk-based models. Secondly, what about, and by the way, in the mainstream in America is called OEP, Open Economic Politics. Okay? That's 97% of the publications. And they have nothing to say. Economic sociology, like your conference here, full of talk about the crisis, because you're not constricted by that assumption. It's only risk. What about international relations theory? If you go back to the 1960s, the most vibrant part of international relations theory was on European integration. And there were three, of course, schools of thought. Stanley Hoffmann, the realist, Karl Deutsch, and the sociological behavioralist, and Ernst Haas and the liberal neo-functionalist. Okay. They have anticipated in that debate on Europe all of the IR discussions since the late 1980s. Hoffmann argued, as a realist, that Europe is like an artichoke. It will become progressively more difficult to tear off the individual leaves of the artichoke as you get closer and closer to the core being the sovereign state. Integration will slow along the way. Pooling of sovereignty has its own self-limiting aspect to it. And of course, crisis would impose those limits. Now, this seems to me a pretty plausible account of what's going on. Secondly, Deutsch, the sociological behavioralist. Mass attitudes for Deutsch are nationalists. They're not supranationalists. It's the elites who are supranationalists. And we have compelling evidence that European elites, including people in this room, are deeply committed to the European integration process. For reasons of history, ideology, lots of things. Okay? But mass publics, at best, provide a permissive consensus. That was the language of the Lindbergh and Scheinberg in 1970. And we now see that mass publics are nationalist. Not to the exclusion of the European identity. They are smart enough to carry several identities in their head, right? But the nationalist part is acting up. So the crisis seems to validate this too. Finally, Haas and the neo-functionalism. For Haas, Europe will be built through crisis, not by avoiding crisis. Crisis is essential. National elites don't want to integrate. They are forced to integrate. They sit on a bicycle, they have to keep pedaling. If they don't pedal, they fall off the bike. This is a wonderful description of Angela Merkel. The German chancellor didn't want to go where she is going. She had no choice. So functionalism is about political costs that politicians have to incur by either stepping up or stepping back from integration. It's about political costs. Politicians are very attuned to this. And in the process of partially pooling your sovereignty, there are always costs, either by stopping or by going forward. So I think the contestations which we now see in Europe very much validate this model. Now, what has emerged in the last 20 years, I think, is a plausible fourth model, multi-level governance. And it is now the site where these three explanations play themselves out. So I think the crisis validates a lot of old theory and a lot of new theory, as long as we keep the politics of it center stage. I've talked too long, right? I've quit on, I would have said something about comparative capitalism, but you can read it in Ian's book. I would have said briefly something about central banks. Central banks are considered to be autonomous. This is the axiom of modern political economy the last 30, 40 years. Swiss and the German US model in 1970 becomes the central bank autonomy is what it's all about. What's really ironic about it is that from the mid-1980s on, developments in central banking are just the opposite. Central banks become not autonomous. The New Zealand central bank is the first one which insists on, We actually have a master. The master is the market. We have to learn how to talk to the market. Be transparent. So that central banks realize that they cannot actually, even in the core, that is the determination of the inflation rate, they can't set the inflation rate. They can set the inflation rate only if they convince market players what the future will bring. That's why Greenspan is so important. He can talk to the markets converge behind his opaque Delphic statements, and he was not a virgin, and he was not drunk or high or whatever that version in Delphic was, you know. But he knew how to pretend that he knew the way, and markets would follow. Right? Central banks lose their autonomy, not to politicians, but to the market in the era of globalization. It's a fascinating story, and people here in Britain have written on economic performativity, and it's an exciting literature. And finally, the primacy of politics. I'm much more lenient than almost anybody on the politicians these days. Everybody's dumping on the politicians. Politicians were not stupid in 1990. The creation of the euro was a political project. It had nothing to do with finance. Economists had never understood this. It dealt with Germany. How can we reassure ourselves that the Germans won't get crazy again? That's a reasonable question in 1990. It was a reasonable question in 1952, 57. Right? How do we internationalize the German military-industrial complex? That's the origin of European integration, the European Coal and Steel Community. How do we prevent the Germans getting a nuclear bomb? Euratom, right? How do we internationalize the German army, the European Defense Community? It's all about Germany. Right? Perfectly plausible within a decade of the loss of World War II. In 1989, this specter haunts Thatcher, Mitterrand. It haunts even some people in Germany. Right? And that is the reason why the euro is created. Economically idiotic. You know, the German central banker, Pearl, resigns within 6 months. He says, you're an idiot on German unification, you're an idiot on Europe. Herr Kohl. Okay. And Kohl says, I'm a politician. I got to win the next election. I can't worry about that stuff. So it was the autonomy of politics. It is now a different kind of politics. And I have infinite trust in European lawyers to rewrite the rules and to break up the euro and create a flexible European monetary system so that some people can devalue the currency so they don't have 60% youth unemployment, which I regard as a tragedy. Okay. So if you look at what the policy of modeling through is producing, you know, I just wrote them down here. The European Financial Stability Facility of 2010 for emergency funding, the long-term refinancing operation, the TRO by this ECB for troubled country bonds, the European Stability Mechanism, the outright monetary transaction, the fiscal compact, all of this, you know, one after the other, every 6 months another crisis meeting. Okay? People show up for their photo op, they write this, you know, against toxic assets of $1 to $2 trillion. So there will be, I'm sure, future life rafts. Politicians are supposed to create life rafts for us. There may be a shipwreck. Maybe we'll sink. Maybe we'll reach the shore. We all know we are living in uncertain times with lots of risks. So is this exogenous or endogenous? Okay. This is nothing exogenous. I do not believe that the euro crisis is due to exogenous sources. This is normal capitalism highlighted by the globalization of finance. It will take, I think, a hit of Icelandic proportions for Britain or the United States as for London and Wall Street, the city of Wall Street, to understand this. I hope I won't see that crisis because I'll end up working until I die. Because my retirements will be wiped out. But so will be you assets. So we will all be in the same boat together. So muddling through of the political variety, I take great heart in. I think it's hard work. You know, and as Camus writes in Limit to Secede, you know, that he rolls up that stone and it falls down again, right? And he walks down. And he's sweaty, and he's dirty, you know, and you must imagine him to be happy. So modern European capitalism, crisis of the